Welcome back, our fellow patriots, to the Save Our Republic daily video series. We have finished the Bill of Rights, the 11th and 12th Amendment, and now we're jumping into the 13th Amendment, which is the first amendment that was passed, I was going to say in the wake of the Civil War, but that's not exactly correct. The 13th Amendment abolishes slavery, and I'll read the text right now. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as punishment for crime, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist in the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. That's Section 1. Section 2 provides Congress shall have power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. This is the first constitutional provision that has a second section which allows for Congress to implement it, and that was done because obviously we fought a terrible civil war in order to eliminate the scourge and terrible stain of slavery in America. And at the time that it was adopted and ratified, it was hardly a secure right, and therefore they wanted to be able to have Congress to be able to implement legislation to enforce it. The amendment was originally passed by Congress. Remember, to have a constitutional amendment adopted, there's a couple different ways. One is the only way that we've used 27 times, and that is that Congress passes by a 2/3 margin the proposed amendment. It goes out for ratification. It's ratified by the states and comes back to Congress, and then it becomes official. And so on January 31st, 1865, Congress passed it. It was not ratified until December 6th of 1865. So if you know your history, you know that the Civil War ended in the spring of 1865. So this was passed during the Civil War, near its end, and it was pretty clear that the North was going to win, but it clearly had not been completed yet. And it was ratified after the Civil War was concluded. A couple of other major points on this. It is the first time that the Constitution actually procures a right not against the government, but against anything. Okay, so normally there would be what we would call state action. A government would have to take an action like I talked earlier in another prior episode about the freedom of speech and how social media companies that deplatform people and cancel them are not violating the First Amendment because it's directed against government. And in fact, it would be a violation of the First Amendment to force somebody to speak something they don't want to. Well, the 13th Amendment doesn't have the state action requirement. It simply says no slavery in the country. And then it has this forceful clause that says in Congress can pass legislation to enforce it. So that would be not just against government entities, but against anyone. It is obvious and has been refrained over and over and over again that when America declared independence in 1776, that we acknowledged the equality of all mankind, and yet slavery existed in many states. And that was a terrible stain that we have been living with ever since, and that we can get into the political realities at the time, but we set out that goal of equality for everyone, and we had obviously this huge blot on our system by having perpetuated slavery after we adopted that founding first principle that all men are created equal. And over time, there was a shift in sentiment, and this is pretty important. Initially, the founding fathers really, that whole founding generation, didn't think slavery was a positive good. They just acknowledged it as a practical reality, that slavery had always existed in every society across, or at least almost every society across time, and that it was an ancient institution, and that it was carried over by the British and others into the colonies, and it had taken root there, and that it was kind of a peculiar institution is what they, some people refer to it later, but it was just a fact of life. when the Declaration of Independence came by, then all of a sudden we realized that we had this founding first principle that we believed in, and there was this rank hypocrisy there, and that generated, and I'm not going to say it was the first reason that it was generated, but it helped propel further attacks, and because there was some attack on slavery by some quarters, like Quakers and others, attacking slavery. But then when we said as a nation that we were founded on the first principle of equality, it seemed very irreconcilable that we would say that and then have slavery, right? So there was this momentous charge to move forward and to abolish slavery that was spurred by the Revolution and the Declaration of Independence. And over time, many of the northern states did indeed abolish slavery or never had it. In fact, Thomas Jefferson ended up being very important to that in connection with the Northwest Ordinance and other areas of reform. On the other hand, once the assaults against slavery really started to take moral momentum by religious leaders and others, then some people in the South, and I suppose in the North as well, argued that actually slavery was a positive good. See, the founders thought it would just go away and die on the vine, it would wither on the vine over time, that they foresaw the death of slavery, they believed it would be abolished at some point. Thomas Jefferson and others who even were slave owners acknowledged that it was wrong and that eventually there would be a terrible reckoning, and they hoped that future generations would be courageous enough to eventually find a smart way to eliminate slavery. Instead, what happened was that people in the South started to defend it as a positive good, justified by religion, and so you had this clashing of world perspectives, which eventually exploded during the Civil War. And so we abolished slavery after hundreds of thousands, 600,000 or so casualties in the Civil War. We adopted the 13th Amendment, and it's extremely important. And today it's still important because early jurisprudence about eliminating slavery through the 13th Amendment recognized it wasn't just the institution of slavery per se, but they would call badges of slavery. So things that kind of carried forward the legacy of slavery, even though it might not be in the same form as chattel slavery, which we would know is slavery in the South, where people were just things that could be traded and abused. And so there's this very courageous and momentous theme of jurisprudence that says that you can abolish the badges of slavery as well. And we hopefully will be able to delve in that in future episodes. But the 13th Amendment really is a fundamental transformational moment in American history in which we abolished the institution of slavery outright and enabled Congress to ensure that it would be eliminated. Until next time, don't forget about America's Survival Guide at americasurvivalguide.com, Patriot Week at patriotweek.org, the Patriot Lessons American History and Civics podcast. Please like, subscribe, and share this video series. God bless you, and God bless America.